G'day everybody, welcome tonight to church. Now if you've got a Bible, an app or whatever, I want you to open up, if you'd like to Lamentations. If we had a Bible quiz, we'd say, where is it? Well, it hasn't moved, it's after Isaiah. It's one of those books that you go, where's it gone? Every time you try to look, you think, it's gone, I've lost it. My Bibles usually don't survive either very long, so that's probably fallen out if it's mine, but I think the thing is, this is a really pretty special part of the Bible, and we're going to start by praying, and then I'll avoid the water. That's cool. Father, thanks for the Bible, and thanks for the way Lamentations helps us see what it means to step into the life you created us for. Help us be aware, Lord, of the ways that we avoid that life. And actually the invitation, how it's just lavished with your goodness and kindness. So we ask that you'd help us to see something fresh about what it means to live. In Jesus' name. So look, I'm pretty convinced that if we were trying to work out to solve any solution between, 80 odd people here, we could have like 500 different answers. But what makes us alike is we've probably got the same questions. You know, we often have the same questions, just different answers. And that's what makes us human, I think. Like, why is it that every 3 to 5 year old becomes a philosopher and says why all the time? I mean, they can't even read a book or tie their own shoes, and it's not even a functional question. You know, who needs to know why? You just want to know, okay, how to use the toilet, where the toilet is, and who to ask. That's really all that matters if you're a kid, right? Yeah, James, your boys, they really need to work that one. That's a bit of a family goal, right? But like, it's so funny watching young parents, I think, thinking, if I answer this really well, we're going to end the whys. And there's nothing ends the why. The why is unstoppable because it's what drives us forward as inquisitive human beings. See, it's interesting in relationship to evolutionary theory because it doesn't make sense that human beings ask why when if the goal is to survive not being eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. You don't need to ask why. It's just where, when, what. That's all you need. You don't need a why. So why do we ask that? Because there's something more to what it means to be human. Scientifically, we have a science problem because if we only needed to know how things worked, we wouldn't need to ask why. Like if that's all we need to know, science would be comprehensive enough. But we have philosophy because science doesn't answer the why question. And when science tries to do, it stops becoming science. So the thing I want to say at the beginning, this book is pretty essential to what it means to be a human being, in that it is wrestling with and helping us learn. It's like masterclass in making sense of life, especially the things that you don't have words for, especially the things that have been the hardest things for you. It's absolutely helping you address, deal, put words to, find a way to deal with the hardship that we go through. And this is the middle of the Bible, and it's dealing with the worst experience of God's people in their history. So no matter how advanced scientifically we become as a species, the thing that drives us forward is the why question as human beings. And so we're going to be exploring two things that are sort of welded together in this book. And it's the pain that we might experience as human beings and the hope that we could embrace. And they're not separate. It's actually the pain that you might experience is connected to the hope that you can embrace. And you can actually step into the pain because of the hope that you can embrace. So they are connected in essential ways. And I hope you sort of get a vibe for this. So I'm going to read chapter 1, or actually seven verses of chapter 1, to give you a sense of what we're stepping into. It's not normal writing. It's actually poetic. If you've ever read poetry, this is like that. It's meant to disrupt you. This is not linear, organised, historical, review of anything. It's not linear. It's not actually like historical narrative. It's poetry. It's actually meant to disrupt. It's got a different purpose. So let me just read chapter 1. There's 5 chapters and there's 3 voices. And so far you're going to hear the narrator. And the narrator is describing the worst event in Israel's history. Let's just get a sense of this. How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she, who once was great among the nations. She who was queen among the provinces has now become a slave. Bitterly she weeps at night, tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers there is no one to comfort her. All her friends have betrayed her, and they have become her enemies. After affliction and harsh labour, Judah has gone into exile. She dwells among the nations. She finds no resting place. All who pursue her have overtaken her in the midst of her distress. The roads of Zion mourn, for no one comes to her appointed festivals. All her gateways are desolate, her priests groan, her young women grieve, and she is in bitter anguish. Her foes have become her masters. Her enemies are at ease. The Lord has brought her grief because of her many sins. Her children have gone into exile, captive before the foe. All the splendour has departed from daughter Zion. Her princes are like deer that find no pasture. In weakness they have fled before the pursuer. In the days of her affliction and wandering, Jerusalem remembers all the treasures that were hers in days of old. When her people fell into enemy hands, there was no one to help her. Her enemies looked at her and laughed at her destruction. You get a sense of where we are? Like, this is epic pain. Faint with tears. It's like not an easy thing. So this is a devastating experience for Israel. This is like, for us, about 2,500 years in the past. So 587, 86 BC, Babylon takes over Jerusalem, and they have a scorched earth policy. They don't just want to win the fight, they actually want to eradicate their culture. So they started, if you're interested, turn back a page, Jeremiah 52 verse 4 and 5 tell us that Babylon sieged the city. And what that means is they get their army and they circle it, and they just camp out. They camp out until they give in. And basically what that means is no supplies come in or out. So for 2 years. And then eventually you see this sort of thing happening. If we read on in verse 11, in chapter 1 it said, all her people groan as they search for bread. They barter their treasures for food to keep themselves alive. People start starving to death. And it gets worse. They're actually driven like to savagery, to eating each other. Chapter 2 verse 20. And says, look, Lord, and consider, whom have you ever treated like this? Should women eat their offspring, the children they cared for? That's horrendous cannibalism to survive. And the temple was flattened. So chapter 4 verse 1, it says the sacred stones are at every street corner. Bam. Never worship again. There's this reality of they're trying to eradicate them. And so what Babylon do, they deport all the like the people who trade, the leaders, the educated class, the prophets, the priests. They move them off and they leave the most impoverished, desperate, sick and lame, thinking in their mind they won't be able to rebuild. And we're going to take these people and we're going to enculturate them and make them Babylonian. That's their goal. They want to just destroy. They even salt the earth where they would do agriculture so they can't grow anything. So it's impossible to use. So it's a horrendous experience. So their land is gone, their city's ruined, their economy's disappeared, everything has gone. As you can see how serious it is for them. And that's on a macro level. On a personal level, on a micro level, just think of the thousands of stories of misery and loss. Like this is starting to tell us there's something huge happening here. And here's the challenge. This is why this thing of lament, which we're going to talk about, and like hope, they have to be wedded together, because the passage James read to us at the beginning of the service was where they were told to not give up, to not give in, and they were told to live the life they were created to live. And the way it was said was seek the peace and prosperity of the city. Now that's a refrain that they always knew, oh yeah, we'll do that for Jerusalem, the eternal city, David's city, but not Babylon. Not the worst expression of the world, the most wicked city. They're called to live this life even in that situation. So there's three options. You can give up, you can give in, or you can lament. And it's essential to living the life they're created to live. Giving up is like disassociate. We don't talk about it, we don't feel it, it's just forget it. Give in is like, okay, well, let's just become like everyone else. Let's just become Babylonian. But the last one's the hardest one. And frankly, there's a lot of churches that have given up. There's plenty of churches that have given in. And there's plenty of us in our families that have given up and given in. Probably, I don't know if it's 20 years ago now, our church had a massive, before I was here, had a massive split. And after I was here for a couple of years, and then I was the youth pastor, I interviewed about 25 people about it. And it had such deep effect, especially on the older people, not the young people so much, but the older people, that it affects everything, decision making. So giving up would mean we just disassociate. We don't talk about the thing. How has it affected us? I can tell you it affected our eldership, our deacons, how we made decisions, our church meetings, the level of anxiety we experience as a church because people are afraid to have a different opinion. It's massive. That's not for no reason. Giving up would be, it's too hard. Giving in would be, we don't make those decisions in Christian ways. Forget what Jesus says. Forget his way of life. That would be giving in. Let's just do this like any other company would. So you can see there's a massive challenge here. And this whole thing of what it means to lament is huge because you've got 5 chapters that are dedicated to the grief and sorrow of the worst moment of their life. I wonder how often we dedicate anything to the worst times in our lives. Just stop and think about this. There's 5 chapters. Can anyone, if you just notice, there's 22 verses in chapter 1. There's 22 verses in chapter 2. There's 66 verses in chapter 3. So it's been multiplied by 3. There's 22 verses in chapter 4 and 5. This is a Hebrew acrostic, which means the first phrase in chapter 1, verse 1, is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. There's 22 of them, right? Does it make sense now? So B for Hebrews, the next phrase starts with the letter B. That's why this is not linear and it's just what's going on. It's a framework to process, to grieve, to say how I've been affected by that terrible experience. That's why it's not, if you're going to find out the details of what's been going on, you've got to jump all over the book because it's an acrostic. If you said, all your favourite foods, go through the alphabet, the alphabet game, letter A, you're going to say food, letter B. It's not going to have a linear thing to it. It's just going to be what's there. And so when you get to the middle chapter, everything is multiplied by 3. It's very intense. The last chapter isn't an acrostic, but it's like a personal prayer, if you like, to finish the thing off. But the reality is we have 3 speakers. We have a narrator who we've heard, we have a woman, and then we have a man who shows up in chapter 3. But it's so foreign to us because, see, if you break your arm, we put a cast on it to give it a safe environment to heal. That's what this structure is. This is the most structured book in the Bible about the worst experience they had. And it's creating a safe place to process the worst thing of my life. Just keep thinking about this because we don't do it well. Denise Hopkins did a study of Episcopalian type churches a number of years ago, like Anglican, Methodist, some churches like Catholic churches that use books to decide what they're going to pray, what passage they'll read or preach from, or songs they'll sing every week of the year. And she said it was the lament psalms. We've got 150 prayers in the middle of the Bible. And she said the ones that deal with grief and sorrow were conspicuously absent. And you read through them, and when it gets to the weird bit, like at the end sometimes where it says, God, kill the wicked, they just leave it out. Right? And then there's another guy, his name's Glenn Temperton. He did another study. He said of the Psalms, you can do a general percentage thing, 150 Psalms, about 60% are all celebration, praise, thank God for life, what you've given. And that's good. 40% or so are lament, dealing with grief, pain, anguish, loss, death, things I don't understand, things that are intolerable, 40%. And then he assessed churches like ours, Presbyterian and Baptist hymnals. And he said they were massively underrepresented. 85% all celebration, only 15% could be called lament. This is why it's so hard. And so think about, how does it affect us as a community when there's such a lack of lament-type songs, conversations, language? A guy who wrote, I always forget his name, Sung Chan Ra, if I got it right. He wrote a commentary on, I think, what's the word? It's a commentary, a book about a technical scholarly book on the book of Lamentations. And he did his own research when he did the book about 7 years ago of the top 100 songs sung by churches, contemporary music. You know, like every time we sing a song, we send the information to the licensing bodies and they record them. And every year they say, here's the top 100 every church used. And he assessed them. And when he did, how many do you reckon in the top 100 songs were lament ones? 40%? Who reckons that? No? Okay. 20%? 10%? Okay, he said there were 5. 5 in the top 100 were lament. And he said he could turn it to 10 when he broadened the category. If it said, I cry out to the Lord. Okay, that's lament, beauty. And then he keeps reading and he goes, I cry out for joy to the Lord. Oh, he goes, it's not lament. But it is, because it says I cry out, so I have to include it. So we're pretty thin on, aren't we, when it comes to music, prayers, conversations, to actually address the hardest things. We're not good at that. It feels odd. And that's why it's odd to read a book that seems to have a strange progression for us. It's meant to disrupt. Poetry is this is weird, it's my favourite form of prose. If I go away, I always go to find a bookshop and buy a poetry book. It's a little thing I do. But I love poetry. But I wonder if you allow yourself to be disrupted by someone's words, because that's what's meant to be happening here. I know you probably don't believe it, but I'm just not fit. Too many Macca's meals for the last decade. So basically, I know, it's hard to think this, but I'm so unfit it's not funny. Like, anyway, the youth group leaders can't believe it because they think, I could smash them at any game, probably, but I can't anymore. I just can't. I'm terrible. So here's the thing. I'm at the moment preparing to get fit. And I was doing some research. What am I going to do? What am I get? Because since 40, I've just given up. And so I thought, I've got to do something here. And I checked out CrossFit, right? And one of their philosophies is muscle confusion. And I thought, I like it. Because that's my philosophy. Like, I don't go to the gym for 4 months and then I go for 1 day and my muscles are very confused as to why we're even here. What are we actually doing? That's my thing. But here's the thing. You need some disruption if you're ever going to change. If you're ever going to change your life, you need to be disrupted. You won't change without trouble, crisis, conflict, or lamenting. I don't think you'll actually embrace the hope God wants for you if you're going to just park the most difficult things to process. And so we need some disruption. Because I want you to notice the language is figurative. See, what's really strange, look how he describes the city. The narrator says, how deserted, verse 1, lies the city, once so full of people. Like a widow is she, described as a widow. She who was queen among the provinces has now become a slave. She's a slave. End of verse 5, her children have gone into exile, captive before the foe. She's also a mum who's lost her kids. How is a city a widow, a slave, and a mum? How's it all three at once? Whose mum? Who's the mum's parents? Who's the mum's kids? How much does it cost to buy a city to make it a slave? Like all the questions. How can it be all three at once? A city doesn't have a gender. How can it be a she? You notice how it just seems wrong that I'm applying that sort of logic to this? It just sort of doesn't make sense because it's actually not. So lament is not composed of lists. It's not primarily propositional language. It doesn't have formulas. That's not what lament is. So what the narrator has done It's taken a common experience, a woman who's lost a husband, a slave that's been bought or sold, a mum that's lost her children, and put that beside their current experience and say, your devastation, our devastation, it was like that. That's what they're doing, trying to help us understand what it's like. I have the privilege of working with amazing youth leaders, beach mission leaders, camp leaders. You guys are so gifted. I reckon anyone under 30 is like a digital genius to me. You guys just freak me out. And you do things with your computers that I just don't, I know I'll never be able to do, no matter how hard I try. I could talk to you about Twitter, and you think, you don't even know what you're talking about. And that's about the best words I got. They start talking about programming and code, and I'm like, I'm out. So much of our world is built on the basis of data, of systems, of those sort of processes, which means it's so good for us because it means we don't have things like polio. You walk around with 10,000 songs in your pocket. We have hospitals. People will be able to watch a video of this talk in a day's time in their home. That's an amazing world. But there's some things in our world that there's no app for. There's no system. There's no new algorithm. Some of the pain that we've been through, it's not so simple to solve. And so that's what you're looking at here. Could be a breakup of a marriage. Could be a loss of a parent. Could be a child that is estranged. It could be you've picked up a terminal illness. It could be you've lost an important job. It could be you don't know what you're meant to be doing with your life. There's so many crises we can find ourselves in. This is about how do you talk about how that's affected you. That's part of what lament is. The word Lamentations in Hebrew literally means how. And it's not the scientific how, it's how did God even let this happen? All the time they're saying, why God? Why did you do this? Why did you do that? Why did you allow this to happen? Giving expression to actually what they've done. And what's difficult is societies like ours don't have the rituals that societies of the past had. To express things like joy and euphoria and loss and heartbreak and death and actually work out how to express that through things. We used to have things like events for that. And things like poetry, liturgies, dance, paint, noise, colour, march, retreats. It's not so our culture, I think, misses those sort of essential rituals to step into some helpful lament. And so this is a masterclass in acknowledging, in naming, and notice how the language is so important. It doesn't say here, okay, we had 554 dads had to bury their daughters, 600 mums had their eyes gouged out. You don't have that sort of, that's not what it's saying. It says the wrath was poured out like fire. You can't do that. Fire's not a liquid, but it's figurative, isn't it? It's telling you something about how this felt. Our enemies gnashed their teeth before us. They opened their mouth and they devoured us. You know what it's saying? That's the type of language that takes you somewhere else. That's why you love music so much. Art, colour, those things are meant to take you somewhere to process these things. You know, literal language is not going to be very satisfactory when it comes to the type of lament you're invited into. It is, though, important to say facts, to talk about what happened. But I want to tell you, when you've experienced betrayal and powerlessness, that's the definition for trauma. When you've gone through trauma, your language systems go offline. It's hard to find words. And when you do, often we find actually childlike words. It's hard to talk about the moment. And so even though you do want to be clear and matter of fact, it's actually quite hard. And so if I just said, he said something unkind to me, my feelings were hurt, and now it makes me challenge the goodness of people. That's very matter of fact. It might be okay. There's nothing wrong. We're actually talking about this isn't fantasy. This came out of a historical moment. So it's good to say what the moment is. But the tone of Lamentations is like, she stabbed me in the back, and then she turned the knife. He kicked me in the guts. That's the tone. You see, it's different. It's like a giantesque language. It's like a spiked language, isn't it? Because it's helping disrupt. It's helping you process how you've been affected. And so let's notice something huge here. You are invited into a life that is honest. The hard thing about lament is we live in a culture of denial. And for some of us, it's our drug of choice. The amount of times in my life, in my work life, especially in my family life, where there's things I should talk to my wife about, my family, my children, all my work colleagues, and I just keep going. I would rather just not talk about it. And that's sometimes a function of denial being my favourite drug of choice, my approach. That's why it's so hard to think about this. So notice the first verse again. The city's deserted. Once it had heaps of people. It's comparing its past to its present. It flourished under David, under Solomon, but then king after king led it astray from God, and now it's been flattened. This was always coming from the way they chose to live. But notice this little line here. End of verse 3, she dwells among the nations. She finds no resting place. By the way, there's so much depth in each one of these phrases. She dwells among the nations now, not in her city, not in her sacred place. She has no resting place. They have no home. They've been extracted from their home. This is traumatic. And it's not just geographical, it's also spiritual because this is believed to be compiled by Jeremiah, the prophet. Most Jewish scholars say that. And the people who remained when they're walking among the rubble. They have no resting place. Even though location is home, it doesn't feel like home anymore. You ever had that experience? So many people who've had that experience, who have that all the time. A man or a woman who've lost their spouse, and home for them. So I know a number of people that say, I don't want to leave my house because all our memories were made here. But every single thing I look at reminds me of the deepest pain I've ever experienced. That's a traumatic experience. And that's actually, what do you do with that? Because I'm in my home, but I have no resting place. It doesn't feel like home anymore. And home for them was everything. The land was everything. It was their identity. It meant future, prosperity, our values, our faith. Everything was connected to the idea of the land. And now, and so I hope you can see that I'm trying to emphasize some obvious struggles we have, because the life, and a healthy life, that God calls us into is one of honesty. But let me say very clearly that the friendship groups, the workplaces, the cultures, the spaces, our marriages, we establish norms of communication, sort of a bit of a sense of what you say, what you don't say. And we sort of generally abide by what people say. You shouldn't say that, don't talk about that sort of stuff. But the more you grow in maturity, the more you grow in connection to God and who you truly are. This is so huge, because your health is going to possibly become a threat to those important friendship groups, workplaces, families, churches. Because when you start to talk about things that everyone thinks isn't appropriate, that actually becomes a problem. You can actually experience being estranged, becoming mature. See, this is a huge thing. And so part of what it means to grow as a Christian is to see how central it is to express what you're actually going through. It's massive. I don't know how many times I've been at a funeral, this year included, where people have apologised for choking up, talking about the loss. I don't know why we do it, but we have this massive issue, feeling like we shouldn't bring that up. Maybe I shouldn't say how I'm struggling with that. I don't know what it is, but we have such a resistance, don't we? If any of you were alive when Princess Diana died, there was a bouquet of flowers put at the gate of the Buckingham Palace, and then that was like open the floodgates. Flowers everywhere. It's like this untapped grief that people got the chance to express through Diana. Same with when Robin Williams took his life. There's a lot of people that were profoundly affected by his death, but it was disproportionate to their life because they didn't actually know him. They just knew his genius, but didn't know him. It seems to me that we have a lot of untapped grief that we walk around with because we haven't learnt what it means to actually step into both the pain that we might experience and the hope we can embrace at the same time. So I guess there's an encouragement here to be less fearful about your interior world, your pain, your fears, your loss, your sadness, the things you don't understand even about yourself or your past. Kathleen O'Connor wrote in her commentary about this. She says, lamenting, lamentate, sounds like some sort of chemical. Lamenting is naming what's wrong, naming what is out of order in God's world, and what keeps human beings from thriving in all their creative potential. That's a cool line. She says, the simple acts of lament expose the conditions that led to the problems. It creates space, that safe place, like the cast for the broken bone, for grief, for mourning to start to happen. And she says, this resistance, which she calls it, is what prepares us for healing. We won't heal without it. I encourage you to watch the movie Spotlight. If you've seen it on the streaming services, watched it multiple times. It's trying to give expression to the real story of Boston reporters reporting on the sexual exploitation of children by the Catholic Church. And if you go to the end of the movie, they list all the suburbs, all the dioceses where that was found, and then they go around the world. And there's about 18 or 19 suburbs in Australia and New South Wales that we're very familiar with. It makes it very personal. And all the way through the movie, it's fighting this denial. Deny. And it really shows you, I think, the courage that's required to say things that feel like we shouldn't say. And I think they depicted really well the characters who were beginning to put language to what happened to them. It was so scary. Can I trust this reporter? Well, I don't even know what I should be saying. I don't know where to start. It was scary. And this is actually how this is how it is when you do this, because we live in a culture of denial. It's hard. See, have you ever said something if you talked about something very personal, very difficult, and someone else dismissed it, sort of minimised it, you got 9 other fingers, you'd be right. I don't know. I don't know if you've had that experience. What do you do inside? You seethe quickly, don't you? You get pretty angry pretty quick. And then sometimes your language gets spiked. This is a timeless biblical reminder that we need to ask the question, what are the conditions that are leading to that sort of language? Why am I feeling that way? Why am I reacting that way? Why did that hurt so much when they dismissed my thing? Maybe I've never talked about it before. Maybe it's bigger than I realise. There's so many things here. And this is where I want us to get into some of the beauty in the different voices here. We have a narrator, you've heard from the narrator, very objectively saying what happened. And then, you should notice this, it's only at the end of verse 9 that the woman's voice appears. It takes it till there for her to say something. And she only says a phrase and then she has to stop. This is so helpful because this is actually what happens when you begin to try to talk about something horrendous, devastating. It's hard. Verse 9, "Look, Lord, on my affliction, for the enemy has triumphed." I read what was in inverted commas. This is how it's put out like poetry, But what they're saying is when it's the female voice, when it's the woman's voice, that character, they attempt to put them in inverted commas, speech marks. So you'll notice straight away the speech marks stop. And then the narrator's back, talks about what's happened, what the enemy has laid hands on their treasures. She saw pagan nations, etc., etc. At the end of verse 11, she speaks up again. Look, Lord, and consider, for I'm despised. And then she starts to get more connected to what's happened to her. She looks around at others now. Is it nothing to you, or you who pass by? Look around and see. Is any suffering like my suffering that was inflicted on me, that the Lord brought on me in the day of his fierce anger? Verse 13, from on high he sent fire, sent it down into my bones. He spread a net for my feet and turned me back. He made me desolate, faint all the day long. Verse 14, my sins, it's not just what God's done, Babylonians, but it's also me. My sins have been bound into a yoke. But she's only noticing her sins for a moment. By his hands they were woven together. They have been hung on my neck, and the Lord has set my strength. He has given me into the hands of those I cannot withstand. She's getting up, right? She's getting up some steam, and she starts to take over. This is wonderful. She's found a voice. This is essential when it comes to lament. It's a thing that we're so uncomfortable with. We're even uncomfortable with the silence. When someone has only got 4 words to say and they don't know what else to say. We have such a culture of denial. We need to fill in the silence, don't we? It's why we carry our phones everywhere. They're always on. We can't go to bed without having them on. We have to wake up with them. Sometimes they're brilliant, but sometimes we do this to avoid. It's actually the giving up piece. Because we don't want to talk, feel, think. This is huge. What this is showing us, how it works. You know, you go into a house, there's TVs in every room, and nothing wrong with TVs in every room, but sometimes you've got multiple ones all on at full ball. Sometimes there's expressions of, we don't like the silence. And so she's showing us when you are beginning to put language to your own journey and trauma, like these people, like the people of Israel, it's very clear how traumatic. It's hard. And we need to understand lament's going to be difficult. It's going to be slow. It's going to be gentle. Because she's in shock. And I want you to notice what she needs. Verse 12, she says, she looks to people around. Is it nothing to you? Like what I've been through? Look around and see. Is any suffering like my suffering? You know what she's saying? What do you think she needs? She doesn't need your great big answer. She just needs you to listen. She wants to be seen. She wants it to be acknowledged. She desperately needs you to take it seriously. You don't need to give her your God theory about it. You just need to listen. Because it's clear that's what people need. That's what people need. Now, there's so much to say here. But if you could get even a sense of Jesus' words that blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Get a sense of the kindness that God's inviting you into, because Psalm 59 says, He is the tear collector. Your grief, your sadness is going to be met with kindness, and God describes Himself in that psalm as the tear collector who collects every tear in His bottle. And how close does someone have to be to you to pick up a tear off your face? It sounds like the Celtic writings about the thin places of the divine between us and God. I think one of the deepest connections with God are where you're willing to step in to the deepest heartache you've been through. Because God over and over is promising to show up. And it's connected to living the life the Israelites were called to live. You know, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13 what love looks like. Amazing picture of love. But he says it as a challenge to the church he's writing to in Corinth. That live like children. That live selfishly and don't emulate that. And he has this throwaway line at the bottom. He says, when I was a child, I lived like a child. I talked like a child. And now as a man, I've given up those childish ways. There's a sense to me The childish way is anything that would inhibit being people of fierce love, who can love patiently, kindly, with generosity, without judgment and bitterness. What would it take to be that sort of a person? And what are the things that stop it? They're the childish ways. And some of those childish ways are my own self-defense mechanisms that I've actually got to drop, because they're stopping me being a person of fierce love. I want you to notice this is the problem for Israel here, because the reason why they were devastated is because they didn't live in light of their identity, of their calling. They were to be different to every other nation. That Abraham was told, you're not going to be like the other nations. Your tribe is going to bless the world. You're going to be a different kind of people, not like every other tribe that's just for protecting their own. No, you're going to be people of fierce love. You're going to bless the world. When Jesus says, shine your light, he's speaking to his people to be that new type of people. And he said things like, bless others, don't exploit them. Leave a corner of your field for the poor among you. That's a different type of people. And I want you to notice how this shifts. We're about to celebrate communion, which is just remembering what Jesus has done in a visceral way. Don't disconnect. Don't make the mistake like the pictures. And by the way, the Bible's sort of, a little bit negative about pictures of God. But like the pictures that we have in history of Jesus compared to God the Father. Like God the Father and Jesus, I love you all. Like we don't realise Jesus is not taking us on a different direction from the way God is revealed here. Not at all. God is so incredibly gracious and kind. It's beyond what we usually want to acknowledge or can even see. In verse 8, the narrator's been describing the city, and it's their fault they're here. Verse 8, Jerusalem has sinned greatly and so has become unclean. It's a big deal for them. And the description of the uncleanness in the next verse, verse 9, her filthiness clung to her skirts. She did not consider her future. Her fall was astounding. There was none to comfort her. And that statement, her filthiness clung to her skirts, it's a euphemism for sex. He's talking about they were sexually immoral. And this is the language the prophets used to describe the way God's people had turned away from God and become like the other nations. And they participated in things like ritual child sacrifice. That's not okay. And then they go to church the next day and get the priest to say, it's all good, peace, 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 when there's no peace. They were living on pretense. They were living a lie. And so that's why he says it. Her filthiness clung to her skirts. It's a deep indictment. But I want you to notice how the narrator's heart begins to break for the woman. Before we get to this amazing chapter 3, where there's a glimmer of hope, the narrator starts to shift perspective and ask new questions on the way to chapter 3. Look at chapter 2, verse 13. The narrator has been very clear that they have been rightly judged by God and described them as an adulteress, right? God's the faithful husband, they're the unfaithful spouse. And then chapter 2, verse 13, the narrator says, what can I say for you? With what can I compare you, daughter Jerusalem? To what can I liken you that I may comfort you, virgin daughter Zion? Your wound is as deep as the sea. Who can heal you? What? That should blow you away. Has anyone ever said that? Your wound is as deep as the sea. Has anyone ever shed tears for you on your behalf and seen the depth of your wounds? See, the narrator has shifted gear here, but look at the description of the city, of the woman. Has shifted the language from her filthiness clung to her skirts. No. How I see you, to what can I liken you that I may comfort you, virgin daughter Zion. You see, one of the questions we have as human beings when you start to process the worst times of your life are things like, is this going to define me forever? It might involve, and it probably does, elements of my own failure and sin. And so the question stands even more personal, doesn't it? Is this going to define me? Can I actually start again? Do I have to carry around that shame for the rest of my life? It's a question we ask. Isn't it amazing that this writer is saying, no, you don't have to be defined by that moment. That is not the last word that's going to be said about you. I'm going to call you virgin daughter, Zion. It's not the last thing. So the suffering, the wound, the heartache, your failure doesn't have to be the last thing that you hear said about you. And you know this, we become so closely associated with our pain that it's just us, it's how we see ourselves. On the person who couldn't get through uni, on the boyfriend who just keeps letting you down. I'm a failure of a dad. On the mum who just can't connect to my daughter. I don't know what it is, but we so define ourselves by the biggest failure, by the deepest heartache. And lament gets you to see the possibility of not only... Because see, you actually get re-triggered, don't you, when you start talking and thinking about the hardest things. It can be actually, for some of us, as bad as when it happened. But here's the thing, it doesn't have to be the last thing said of you. It doesn't actually have to define you. And one of the most difficult things for us is to imagine a relationship with a holy, perfect God that is based on his forgiveness of everything. Absolutely everything. I mean, what relationship do you ever begin by you coming up with, these are all the things I do bad? You never do that. And you and I, there'd never be a second date, right? So just as they're about to eat, she's about to start eating, you say, oh, by the way, I don't pay. Or, oh, I'm still going out with my boyfriend. Like you'd never have a second date. How amazing is it that God sees every crack, every break, every flaw in you. And he still loves you. And see, Paul said, it's not just that, see, you and I reckon we think that God tolerates us, but that's not the deal. God is not like that. He created you and he decided before creation of the whole universe that he was going to love you. So good days and bad days, God's still at work. How amazing is God that despite our hypocrisy, he lavishes forgiveness on us. Listen to this verse from Paul. In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of our sins according to the riches of his grace, which he, here's that word, lavished upon us in all wisdom and insight. I love that. It's extravagant. It's over the top. He lavishes us with forgiveness. That's the heart of God for his people. Chapter 3, we're not going to pull it apart at all, but I want you to notice there's so many things said about this passage. It's actually the center point. It's 3 times an acrostic, so it does 3 phrases, AAA, BBB, goes through the alphabet. And when it gets to even the middle verse, there's something to see. That if anything, it should remind us of Jesus. Because what this does, it's not saying this is actually meant to be a picture of Jesus on the cross for you. But it anticipates this man coming on your behalf. The first verse, this is where the man shows up. Chapter 3, verse 1. I am the man who has seen affliction by the rod of the Lord's wrath. There's a lot said about that, by the way, because the other top place that the rod shows up is Psalm 23. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. People get confused. They're not the same. The staff is the guide. The rod is like a weighted stick. It's like the baseball bat to fight off predators. There's comfort in what this is saying. what happens to this man becomes a picture of protection for us. So just reflect on what you've already heard in your life about Jesus dying in our place. Just think of the images, the stories of Jesus, and notice what's happening here. Not just their anguish, not just maybe your anguish. You'd probably relate to this because there's pictures here of all sorts of heartache, all sorts of struggle. There's pictures of being in turmoil. There's pictures of being afraid, humiliated, weighed down, trapped. Verse 2, he has driven me away and made me walk in darkness rather than light. Jesus hung on the cross in darkness for hours. Indeed, he has turned his hand against me again and again all day long. Verse 4, he has made my skin and my flesh grow old, broken my bones. He has besieged me and surrounded me with bitterness and hardship. He has made me dwell in darkness like those long dead. He has walled me in so I cannot escape. He has weighed me down with chains. Even when I call or cry out for help, he shuts out my prayer. My God, why have you forsaken me? Remember that? He has barred my way with blocks of stone. He has made my paths crooked, like a bear lying in wait, like a lion in hiding. He dragged me from the path and mangled me and left me without help. He drew his bow and made me the target for his arrows. He pierced my heart with arrows from his quiver. I became the laughing stock of all my people. They mock me in song all day long. He has filled me with bitter herbs and given me the gall to drink. He has broken my teeth with gravel. He has trampled me in the dust. I've been deprived of peace. I have forgotten what prosperity is. So I say, my splendor is gone and all that I had hoped from the Lord. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I well remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. Can't you hear the pain? There's something incredible here because you and I know what this writer could not know. And we know that Jesus experienced the full wrath of God for my sin. So my sin, your sin, gets to be dealt with two possible ways, on the cross or in hell. This is the amazing picture of what Jesus does on our behalf, so there's no more wrath to come. If he's paid the price for your sin on the cross, that's it. There's no more wrath to come. But notice this is written to like 570, 87 or whatever, 500 years before Jesus. Jesus isn't different. He's not a different God to our God of the Scriptures, the same God. And that's why we have what comes next. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we're not consumed. For his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. The Lord is good to those who hope in him, to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man to bear the yoke while he is young. And down to verse 31. For no one is cast off by the Lord forever. Though he brings grief, he will show compassion. So great is his unfailing love. And here's the kicker. This is the center verse of the book. The whole structure of the book is telling a Hebrew person, look for that verse. And it says, for he does not willingly bring affliction or grief to anyone. That's the heart of God to us. He's not tolerating us. He loves us, like Jeremiah said, with an everlasting love. It changes everything. And so in a few moments, we're going to celebrate just by taking a bit of bread. It's a little bit piecemeal. It's meant to imitate breaking off bread like Jesus' body was literally torn apart for us. We drink a bit of grape juice to remind ourselves that it's actually his blood was spilt for us. Remember that verse? He lavished forgiveness on you by his blood. He copped it all. Not just got punched out, not just got whipped. He died. And when we do this, we remember the fact that he actually beat the power of death. No one else does that. And the only reason you've got any stories about Jesus in the Gospels, the only reason is because he rose from the dead. When Jesus was killed, they all did the bolt. They all thought it was going to happen to them next. The only reason anything was said about Jesus. See, when Buddha died, Gautama Siddhartha, the priest, all his disciples were around him. And they then, after that, decided to put his writings together for people. They did the bolt on Jesus. Nothing was written. But when he rose from the dead, man, they had stuff to say. We have stuff to say. That's where our hope lies. But how's it come? It came because he's compassionate, because his mercies, they never cease. We're not consumed because of his love. How amazing. That's amazing. So I'm going to pray, and I just want to invite the people who are going to, so a few people are going to come and help serve communion. If you're not a Christian, just chill about the communion. You don't have to. Don't feel weird. I know it might feel weird. This is probably the most weird thing we do. But here's the thing. It's a tangible reminder. And I think what a better day, if you want to become a Christian, in your heart and mind, to say to God, I give you my life because you gave your life for me. 2,000 years ago, Jesus gave his life for you. He's waiting for you to give your life to him. That's what it means to become a Christian. Give your life to him. Allow him to support and fill and encourage and comfort and guide. And so this is a picture of that. But we don't want this to be a ritualistic thing where you feel forced to do it, to look okay. We love you even if you don't agree with us, or even if you're not sure you're not a Christian. We love you. We love you. So I'm going to pray, and we're going to celebrate what Jesus has done. Father God, thank you for the reminder, but more than that, thank you for your presence among us now. Thank you for the way the Bible opens the door for us to embrace the reality of the hope that you never leave us or give us up. And we forget, Lord, the fact that Jesus was weary and experienced woes, pain and sorrow. And he identifies with us, Lord. We forget that. We forget that you know what it's like to live our life. You know how hard it is for us to be us. I thank you for how compassionate you are, that we've seen in Lamentations, the invitation to actually grieve and lament, to be able to grow and be people of fierce love. We ask you to help us to trust you in the midst of that, to trust your sovereignty rather than give in or give up. We thank you for the call and the promise. In Jesus' name, amen.